Citizen Kane is often considered the pinnacle of Western cinema, not to mention actor and director Orson Welles' magnum opus. The 1941 film, Orson's directorial debut, demonstrated the abilities of the moving image as a language and incorporated depth of field and multi-layered shots in ways that had until that point been undiscovered. Following Orson Welles' 1938 radio broadcast of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, a number of motion picture studios contacted him with offers to participate in his own motion picture. In almost unheard of circumstances, he was given full artistic and financial control by the studio that would eventually produce Citizen Kane. The film was unfortunately considered a commercial flop, but garnered critical acclaim as soon as it was released. Citizen Kane was nominated for 9 Academy Awards, of which it won 1 in the category of Best Original Screenplay. It also won the New York Film Critics Circle Award for Best Film in 1941. For a time after its release, Orson Welles' debut film fell off the radar, and it wasn't until the 1950s, with its revival as an American classic by critics like Jean-Paul Sartre, that it became an integral part of the medium's historical canon. According to the Internet Movie Database, Orson Welles would go on to direct over 40 titles and act in at least 110 more. Titles such as Chimes at Midnight, Touch of Evil, and Othello are often considered among his best, but it is Citizen Kane that contributed the most to film as an art form. The following scene is an extract taken from the start of the film and will be looked at in greater detail to demonstrate the specific techniques employed by Orson Welles, which have since become so revered. The clip was chosen for a number of reasons. First and foremost, because it is quite rich in symbolism and cinematic language. Furthermore, it is a scene which represents not only the form of Citizen Kane, but the content as well, in the sense that many of the shot compositions and decisions foreshadow the growth of Charles Foster Kane through his life.
Kane, I think we shall have to tell him now.
Yes. I'll sign those papers now, Mr. Thatcher.
You people seem to forget that I'm the boy's father.
It's going to be done exactly the way I've told Mr. Thatcher.
There ain't nothing wrong with Colorado. I don't see why we can't raise our own son just because we come into some money. If I want, I can go to court. A father has a right to. A boarder that beats his bill and leaves worthless stock behind. That property is just as much my property as anybody's, now that it's valuable. And if Fred Graves had any idea all this was going to happen, he'd have made out those certificates in both our names.
However, they were made out in Mrs. Kane's name.
He owed the money for the board to the both of us.
The bank's decision on all matters concerning...
I don't hold with signing my boy away to any bank as guardian.
I want you to stop all this nonsense,
The bank's
Jim.
decision on all matters concerning his education, his places of residence, and similar subjects is to be final.
The idea of a bank being the guardian.
I want you to stop all this nonsense, Jim.
We will assume full management of the Colorado load, of which I repeat, Mrs. Kane, you are the sole owner.
Where do I sign, Mr. Thatcher?
Right here, Mrs. Kane.
Mary, I'm asking you for the last time. Anybody'd think I hadn't been a good husband,
The sum of $50,000 a year is to be paid to you and Mr. Kane as long as you both live, and thereafter to the survivor.
Well, let's hope it's all for the best.
It is.
Why I can't raise my own boy is more than I can understand.
Go on, Mr. Thatcher.
Everything else, the principal as well as all monies earned, is to be administered by the bank in trust for your son, Charles Foster Kane, until he reaches his 25th birthday, at which time he is to come into complete possession.
Charles! Go on, Mr. Thatcher.
Well, it's almost 5, Mrs. Kane. Don't you think I'd better meet the boy?
I've got his trunk all packed. I've had it packed for a week now.
I've arranged for a tutor to meet us in Chicago. I'd have brought him here with me, but...
Charles! Looky, Mom!
Better come inside, son.
Well, that's quite a snowman. Did you make that all by yourself, my lad?
Maybe I'll make some teeth and whiskers.
This is Mr. Thatcher, Charles.
Oh.
How do you do, Charles?
He comes from the east.
Wow.
Hello, Charlie.
Charles?
Yes, Mummy?
Mr. Thatcher's going to take you on a trip with him tonight. You'll be leaving on number 10.
That's the train with all the lights on it.
You going, Mom?
Well, no, your mother won't be going right away, Charles, but she'll be...
Why,
Where am I going?
You're going to see Chicago and New York and Washington, maybe. Ain't he, Mr. Thatcher?
He certainly is. I wish I were a little boy going on a trip like that for the first time.
Why aren't you coming with us, Mom?
We have to stay here, Charles.
You're going to live with Mr. Thatcher from now on, Charlie. You're going to be rich. Your ma figures, well, that is, me and her decided this ain't the place for you to grow up in. You'll probably be the richest man in America someday, and you ought to
won't
get
be
an
lonely,
education.
Charles.
Lonely, of course not. Why, we're going to have some fine times together. Really we are, Charles. Now, shall we shake hands? Oh, come. I'm not as frightening as all that, am I? Now, what do you say? Let's shake.
Why, Charles.
Charles, you almost hurt me. What's that?
Charlie, Charlie.
What's that to just lay with?
What happened?
Mom!
You're... I'm sorry, Mr. Thatcher. What that kid needs is a good thrashing.
That's what you think, is it, Jim?
Yes.
That's why he's going to be brought up where you can't get at him.
Well, Charles. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
And a Happy New Year. In closing, may I again remind you that your 25th birthday, which is now approaching, marks your complete independence from the firm of Thatcher & Company, as well as the assumption by you of full responsibility for the world's 6th largest private fortune. Have you got that?
The world's 6th largest private fortune.
Yes. Charles, I don't think you quite realize the full importance of the position you are to occupy in the world. I am therefore enclosing for your consideration a complete list of your holdings, extensively cross-indexed.
Dear Mr. Thatcher.
It's from Mr. Kane.
Go on.
Sorry, but I'm not interested in gold mines, oil wells, shipping, or real estate.
Not
One
interested, One item on your list intrigues me, the New York Inquirer. A little newspaper I understand we acquired in a foreclosure proceeding. Please don't sell it. I'm coming back to America to take charge. I think it would be fun to run a newspaper. I think it would be fun to run a newspaper.
In the initial 7 seconds of the clip, we see a young Charles Foster Kane, portrayed by actor Buddy Swan, playing in the snow alone. The wide-angled shot, composed to have Kane contrasted against the white background, already demonstrates his isolation. Having Kane as the dominant in the shot and surrounding him with a sparse environment also begins to foreshadow the way in which the young man will eventually distance himself from his family and, ultimately, society. In the context of his character, it is also noteworthy that he is centered in the frame, demonstrating the idea that Kane wants to be at the center of attention. The camera then begins to track backwards, revealing that Kane is being seen through a window by his mother, his father, and Mr. Thatcher. This shows his loss of power as he becomes a subsidiary contrast in the shot, and his parents and future guardian become the dominants. In terms of character proxemics, the separation of Charles Kane and his parents through a window demonstrates that he is becoming both physically and emotionally distanced from them. As the tracking shot continues, young Kane continues to be seen in the background for almost the entirety of the conversation between the other characters. This technique once more serves to show that, although Charles is still in the frame, he has been pushed to the background, or the back of his parents' mind. What is perhaps most notable about this shot is the use of depth and multiple planes of action. Orson Welles was one of the first filmmakers to use a deep depth of field, developing new lenses in order to accomplish the look he had envisioned. This shot is a perfect demonstration of this technique, with Kane's mother and Mr. Thatcher in the foreground, his father in the midground, and Charles in the background, all in crisp focus. Having the separate planes of action shows the hierarchy of the characters, where the mother is in control, the father is on the sidelines, and Charles has no part in the decision being made. Furthermore, the use of character proxemics shows Mrs. Kane and Mr. Thatcher very close together, and slightly distanced from Mr. Kane, demonstrating that Mr. Thatcher and Mrs. Kane are the only ones who truly play a part in the decisions being made. The power struggle is also shown in the composition of the shot, with the father on the left, the mother and Mr. Thatcher on the right, and Charles, who is the source of the argument, in the center. We need to remember this for a shot that appears later in the film as well. As the conversation progresses, the camera tilts up to reveal Mr. Kane at a low angle as he makes an attempt to gain power. However, as Charles's mother speaks and reasserts her control over the situation, the camera switches back to an eye-level shot and the father leaves the frame, now completely out of power. Approximately 1 minute and 40 seconds into the sequence, the young Charles is finally covered through the window for the first time. In one regard, his father's movement towards the center of the frame, shielding his son, could demonstrate his protective instinct and his attempt to shelter his son from the decisions being made. Charles's father also closes the window at this point in time, trying to allow his son the comfort of ignorance and not having to listen to the fact that his parents are deciding to send him away from home. Almost immediately after this, Charles's mother returns to the window and opens it again, both demonstrating once more that she has the power in the relationship between her and her husband, and attempting to bring Charles back into the decision process. At this juncture, it is important to note that for the past 2 minutes, there has been a single continuous shot. What this serves to accomplish is a sense of continuity and flow. By not interrupting the sequence with edits, the tension is retained and the camera is unobtrusive, keeping the audience's belief suspended. As we see the first edit in almost 2 minutes, there is a sharp contrast to a close-up on Mrs. Kane's face as she communicates with her son. The slight low angle puts her in a position of power, and the fact that young Charles is not at all visible once more demonstrates his exclusion from the decisions being made and his separation from family members. Mrs. Kane is in the foreground, with Mr. Kane over her shoulder to the right, and Mr. Thatcher in the background to her left. We are reminded of the symbolic angel and devil on one's shoulders that is meant to demonstrate the dissonant sides of the human conscience. As Mr. Thatcher speaks and his opinions begin to be heard, he moves away from the background and towards the midground over Mrs. Kane's shoulder. This shows a shift in power as Mr. Kane becomes even more helpless in his son's future. As far as lighting, we see that Mr. Thatcher is very evenly lit with a high-key lighting schematic, whereas Mr. Kane is not as evenly lit with a dark shadow cast over the left side of his face. Symbolically, these lighting decisions could demonstrate who is supposed to be perceived in a positive light and who is supposed to be perceived in a negative light. Cutting ahead approximately 20 seconds, there is a tracking shot which exits the interior and moves out of the window towards the exterior. Charles Foster Kane enters the screen, holding his wooden sled as his mother and Mr. Thatcher approach him from indoors. Father Kane lags slightly behind, once more reiterating that he is no longer in a position of control. In terms of character proxemics, having Mr. Thatcher and Mrs. Kane move in front of Charles gives the audience an impression of him being quite small in comparison. There is a rather interesting reversal as well, as I mentioned beforehand, as we see Mr. Thatcher and Charles's mother once more together, this time on the left of the screen, with Charles himself on the right and the father centered in the middle, now the component who is not important to the sequence. This is a throwback or a familiar image to a scene that we saw earlier in the sequence, where Charles Foster was in the middle and his parents were on either side of him, with Mr. Thatcher still grouped with his mother. Charles moves towards his father at this point in time, and the two of them are composed in the center of the frame, with Mr. Thatcher and Mrs. Kane on either side, with their backs to the camera. This, in many ways, attempts to demonstrate who our sympathies should lie with. Charles and his helpless father, pleading as they face the audience, whereas his mother and Mr. Thatcher are closing in from either side, blocking our view of the characters. Deciding to have their backs face the camera helps establish the two characters as objects rather than people, dehumanizing them so we no longer feel emotionally related to them. When Charles moves once more to the foreground, his mother now stroking his hair, we see a connection between the characters that has until this point not been explored. Foreshadowing the role that Mr. Thatcher will eventually try to assume in the boy's life, he has also been placed in the foreground, on the same level as Mrs. Kane. With Kane's father left out of the scene, he is no longer involved in Charles's life. Some moments later, after Kane's father speaks, his mother moves around to separate the two of them, bringing Charles into her arms. Although perhaps a slight stretch, the image of a mother wearing a headscarf protecting her child evokes impressions of the Virgin Mary, perhaps the most iconic mother of all time. When Mr. Thatcher eventually speaks to Charles, trying to appeal to his senses, the young boy immediately attacks him with his wooden sled. This is in many ways an extremely accurate depiction of their relationship and foreshadows the rebellious attitude that he champions later in the film. The final shot of the confrontational sequence is a close-up on Mrs. Kane, which then pans down to a close-up on Charles's face. By ending a sequence which is made up almost entirely of medium shots and wide shots, these close-ups serve to contrast the conclusion with the rest of the scene, showing a connection between Charles and his mother in their final moments together. Orson Welles decided to segue this sequence with the next by including a shot of Charles's abandoned sled, now covered in snow. This symbolizes two important things. First of all, Charles's departure from his family is shown with the abandoned sled. In addition, and perhaps more importantly, the sled foreshadows his departure from childhood and innocence, and all that he has until this point in time known. Because we do not see Charles develop through his teenage years and meet up with him again only as he is a young man, this is the only indication that we have of his departure from being a kid. To segue from the abandoned sled to the following scene, the camera fades to a new sled that Mr. Thatcher has purchased for Charles. The camera pans to an extreme low angle, revealing the towering figure of Mr. Thatcher above the young boy, demonstrating his commanding power over the boy. Additionally, the shot has been lit with a low-key lighting schematic, contrasted to the more high-key shots of the sequence before. This change in lighting shows a transition from the comfortable life Charles was used to leading to the almost oppressive nature of his new situation. The final moments of the sequence show Mr. Thatcher as he dictates a letter to Charles Kane, now a young man. Besides a moment near the end of the sequence when there is a close-up of Mr. Thatcher breaking the fourth wall and looking straight at the camera, the scene is not noteworthy in its cinematography. Mr. Thatcher's glaring expression into the lens is used only as a representation of his anger and frustration towards Charles, and helps the audience feel this emotional reaction to Kane's decision by putting us in his shoes. We almost have the feeling of Thatcher staring at us rather than the character of Charles Foster Kane. Whether or not the Bildungsroman stylings of Citizen Kane's plot appeal to you or not, as filmmakers and budding film scholars, the strength of the cinematography is undeniable. There is a reason why Orson Welles' 1941 film will continue to be recognized in its achievements. It not only succeeds as a story, but manages to set the bar for cinematography at a level that is still today considered standard.